the founder and a president of the Peace Education Hub, which was established at the University of Sarajevo in early 2020. Please join me in welcoming Larisa Kasumagić-Kafedžić. Great.
So good afternoon, everyone. Dobar dan I dobrodošli. My name is Larisa Kasumagić-Kafedžić. I apologize for such a long last name and very complicated at the same time. So I come from, as my dear colleague Isabel and Angelica extended these were welcome notes, I come from the University of Sarajevo. I come from the country of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And let me just see if this would work for us to move on. Yes, so I prepared just a little bit of the visual to connect you to the place, geographical place of the country that I come from. So you can see Bosnia and Herzegovina surrounded by Slovenia, Croatia, Serbia, Montenegro, Albania, Kosovo, Macedonia, all of the countries that used to be, except for Albania, of course, that used to comprise the former Yugoslavia, the country that I was born in. So I was born in the country that is non-existent at the moment, but that as a result of the war broke down or broke out into several other countries. And this is actually the country and the language that I represent today. I teach at the Faculty of Philosophy. So this is my home university. You can see it over there. And this is the main building of the University of Sarajevo. I studied at that university for my bachelor degree right after the end of the war. So in 1996, I got enrolled at the Faculty of Philosophy as a bachelor student for bachelor degree in English language, literature, and culture. And I earned my degree in English language teaching. So I got a profession in teaching English as a second language. And this is the city which is my home now. So the city of Sarajevo. Of course, Ithaca is at the present my home, my second home, but this is the city where I have been living for many years now. So since 1996, and I have been teaching at that university for more than 15 years. I prepared this very brief outline of my lecture. So I'm going to speak briefly about my position as an educator, as a teacher, as a language teacher, as a teacher educator, and as a peace activist, which creates sort of positionality of myself as a researcher, as a teacher in this discussion around the connection between language and peace. So I'll speak briefly about this positionality that is closely related to my teacher identity, the way I understand it. I will then discuss briefly the context of Bosnia. I know that each country has got their own unique context, so each country has got their own unique challenges and opportunities at the same time. And I will try to reveal and just present, illustrate a little bit of the framework that is related to the context of Bosnia and Herzegovina that makes the work of peace building and peace education so much more critical and relevant in the context of my country and in the context of education, but I'll also try to connect it to the global community. I'll speak briefly also of the theories and the backgrounds. To my knowledge, I'm still a learner, so I'm still exploring and researching and developing this field and my understanding of the field, but I'll speak briefly about the theories that have informed my own work as a language educator and as a teacher educator that primarily relate to peace education, peace pedagogy, and peace linguistics. And then as a final stage of my lecture, I'm going to present through some illustrative examples. I'm going to share some teaching practice examples from the context of Bosnia, but also from the context of global community that relate and that are connected to the importance of introducing and infusing peace values into the context of language education. So I will be discussing at the institutional level, the role of university in general, but also at a more sort of narrow, more specialized lenses. I will discuss the role of language teaching and language learning in connection to peace. So let me start off just by introducing, I think you could sort of get an idea or get a sense of why I chose peace. I briefly mentioned a little bit of my background, but let me reiterate and let me sort of bring this up front of why I chose to choose the topic of peace in connection to language and why I have been researching, doing peace work, and having been committed to the peace work throughout my life. So this is connected, as I briefly introduced in the beginning, to the identity, to my teacher identity, the way I understand it, in connection to using language as an access to healing, which happened during the war in Bosnia. And I'll explain briefly how that happened for me. And also understanding how I used language and later on language pedagogy and language education to have access to peace through language, and how I positioned myself in this determination as a teacher educator to promote the frameworks and the policies and the values that would promote peace through language teaching. So let me start off with this first image where you see some of the children's work. So this could be traced back to the 90s in the context of Bosnia that was raging in war in the 90s. And this war produced a lot of suffering for almost everyone living in Bosnia, but also living as refugees or living as displaced, forcibly displaced people around the United States, around the world, around the globe in general. So the images of the houses in this drawing, these are the images of the children that I worked with for several years as part of a local NGO that I helped establish during the war in Bosnia, which was a local NGO started by several women, including myself. And we worked on the issues of war trauma, of war traumatized children during the war in Bosnia. Since I had this gap in my education for not being able to go to school as a result of the war for 4 years, so I couldn't go to school, I couldn't study. I was fresh from high school when the war broke out. So I had 4 years of the war, living through the war, and for some time also living as a refugee in Germany, but doing something that has restored my sort of sense of meaning and dedication to pedagogical work and psychosocial work that greatly established my sense of commitment to peace and nonviolence philosophy. And it was in these first early years of my work as a young teenager in such a context that I actually used English as a window into something that has revealed a lot of learning and a lot of reflection and a lot of sort of psychological support that I have been going through since the war and was going through since during that time, that sort of provided understanding of what was happening to children and young people at a time in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So knowing a little bit of English, so I was fresh from high school. English was not my second language. English was my foreign language. I started learning English in the former Yugoslavia. This was at the age of 12. So English was introduced. It was English and Russian that were introduced at the age of 12. So in the 5th grade, knowing a lot of the theories now from language acquisition, this is considered rather late. But I learned it through the primary and secondary education to be able to use these big, thick dictionaries, to browse through the words and vocabulary, to get a window, to have this access to something that was healing, because I was translating the literature in psychosocial support and war trauma for children at a time. So this is the connection of the language, the way I have understood it and the way I have experienced it as a young teenager. Then several other images facing history and ourselves. I'm not sure you might be familiar. This is a program based in Boston, Massachusetts. When I was a graduate student here at Cornell 20 years ago, I did my professional affiliation, which means my professional internship for several months, working in this organization of facing history and ourselves. And this was very formative for me at the time as a graduate student here at Cornell, with some experience of the work in psychosocial support and nonviolence education and peace education in schools, because this program of facing history has enabled me access to understanding how history and historical and cultural texts and contents could be used to empower the learners, not just through the history, but also through the language. Because this program involved not just history teachers, but also social studies teachers, arts teachers, including also English language teachers. So it was really eye-opening for me in a way that it has changed the perception of the teachers and the teachers' role and empowerment that I needed at the time, but that I also understood at a time that also later on greatly defined the work that I have done since then. The Introduction to Nonviolent Communication by Dr. Marshall Rosenberg. Again, I'm not sure if some of you are familiar, but this was also like breakthrough in my professional education at the time. So I worked closely with Dr. Marshall Rosenberg, who was a student at the time of Carl Rogers, the humanistic psychology father, if you want. And he has been greatly influenced by humanistic psychology, and he combined the work in psychology with communication by proposing something that has become the model of nonviolent communication that at a time was used as a process of healing for people going through the traumas, but it was also used as a tool, as a very constructive, communicative tool that we have integrated through the education, working with teachers with different schools around Bosnia and Herzegovina, but it's also informing a lot of the decisions that I'm making today as a teacher educator in the context of Bosnia. So here you see some of the frameworks and models that have been based on the philosophy and on the frameworks of Marshall Rosenberg. So you see the elements of observations, feelings, needs, requests, where language actually plays a very important critical role in the way we understand how language is used and how we can use it either to sort of promote something that is more empathic and understanding, or use it also to deepen the divisions between people and to just contribute even further to misunderstanding and these breakdowns in communication. So this is briefly the positionality that I wanted to discuss. And this leads us to the framework of my own country. I will briefly speak of the educational system in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is, as you probably know, a very small country. So we are less than 4 million people, 3.6 million people live in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but we have so many issues and so many political and economic challenges after the war, 30 years, even 30 years after the war. Let me briefly just mention some of these contexts that might translate to your own communities, to your own context, or maybe can connect that to something that you're struggling with in your own frameworks of living and working and teaching. So what are the issues in our education system? By studying these internal structures of the educational system, we get to the conclusions that it's a very complex and very conflicting educational system, very contradictory system that is a result of deep divisions that have been in place as a result of the war. So after the war, where the most devastating, I would say after the Holocaust in the Second World War, this has been the worst violence scenario that has happened on the continent of Europe. Even though we had said no more to the Holocaust, after the Holocaust, this was really something that has been witnessed and has been experienced as some of the most and the worst experiences raging in that part of the world. So that has produced a lot of these very conflicting and very complex systems and very complex situations that produce something that we call a unique system, but unique not for the good reasons, really unique for the reasons that it's very complex. It's very much fragmented and very much divided. And I chose here just to illustrate through the language, because this is something that is important for us as language teachers, how these complications or these complexities actually play out in the educational system. So the ethnic-based curricula is something that is really inhibiting us to move forward in terms of introducing something that is more inclusive and more healing and more comprehensive in the context of Bosnia, in the context of such deeply divided society. So the fragmentation of such system is grounded in a commitment to maintaining the narratives that are of narrow party and ethno-national group interests. So this is how the language is used, to promote the interests of one ethno-national party. And we have lots of different parties, and we have 3 ethnic groups, we have 3 different religions, and we have lots of these complications that arise as a result of these deep fragmentations. The system largely relies on rote memorization and teaching from the textbook, which does not foster analytical thinking skills, critical media literacy, or civic citizenship. And this is again related to pedagogy. So the way we teach greatly influences and is deeply reflected in the outcomes that we see as a result of such practices that we use in education. So it's still based very much on rote memorization, encyclopedic, if you want, information memorization. Even though there have been some changes introduced, it is still largely based on such frameworks in terms of pedagogy. Then these models in education, which we call ethnification models, they promote the narrative of us versus them. So there's a lot of victimization. We suffered more than you did. Look at us, what you did to us. So there is a lot of that division of us versus them that is not, and this mentality in this particular post-war region that has experienced little genuine political and social reconciliation is another stumbling stone in the process of recovery, but also in the process of introducing something that is more transformative reform in education. Also, doctrinal religious instruction after the war. When I was a student in the former Yugoslavia, religion was kept outside of the school. After the war, there was a massive introduction of doctrinal religious education, and this is very controversial and contested because it has become the most important subject for a lot of people in the country. And also another reason, external efforts to support the reforms have failed to address the root causes and problems. So it's really cosmetic sort of change that we are introducing. So if we introduce like media and technological advancement, we are really not getting into the depth of the problems, into the deep and very important discussions. The representation in history, again, important for us as language teachers. This was part of a large study that was done in 2007 and again in 2017. And the textbooks have been analyzed. So again, this is a sort of a language discourse, a discourse material of the textbooks that has been analyzed as part of the study. And what we have learned as part of this research was that, for example, history in the textbooks across the curriculum and across different communities, we have seen that war is still seen as an integral part of life. And that wouldn't be so much of a problem that there is not also an extension to this, and that is that consequences of wars and peace agreements are discussed only from the perspectives of the state and political influences, rather than humanizing the suffering and humanizing of what war practices actually produce. Not just there, but violence in general, what they produce as actions of violence in any context. So this individual perspective of the individual historical narratives, they have not been introduced in the context of education. And only 14% of the analyzed textbooks develop an open and flexible attitude towards your own group and those outside of it, as well as challenge deeply rooted stereotypes. Only 14%. So that shows that there is still a huge reinforcement of something that is a stereotype, that is a trauma-based sort of narrative that is played out through the textbooks and through the pedagogies that we still use. And this is a very unfortunate and very tragic reality of the society we live in my opinion. Also, there is relatively very little research on how peace resources circulate among BH educators. So there's such a big emphasis on war and on the war narratives, as opposed to introducing something that are some more positive and more peace-oriented practices that I'm going to argue and advocate for could be to a great extent achieved also through language teaching. Here are the images in support of the context that I come from. These are the images from the playground, from the playroom in the city of Sarajevo, that invite young children to come and play for the birthday party. So this is the invitation that my son received just several years ago to come and attend a birthday party of their friends in school, in primary school. So it's in our language, but you can see airsoft training. You have the date, oprema, replike, municija. So you have equipment, military equipment. You have replicas of the weapons. You have all ammunition, and you can have entertainment. So the zone of good entertainment and training 30 years after the war. And I had such a fierce and very deep and very upsetting and very, very heartbreaking conversation with my son when he received this on his Viber to go and attend this birthday party. So I immediately went and checked on the website. It's in the middle, at the center of Sarajevo. So you see birthday celebration for children. So you can see airsoft war zone. And if you go to their website, they have the cakes in the shape of the bombs. They have simulations of like being fully equipped in the militant and military sort of dresses, and they celebrate, they entertain themselves. So it was very heartbreaking for me. And I had to tell to my son that he was not going to go to that birthday party to entertain himself. And he was the only one who didn't attend. And later on, when he came back from the playground, he told me, like, the kids asked me why I didn't come. I was the only one. And I asked him, so what did you tell them? He said, oh, my mom, she's a teacher. She said it's not good for our development. So this was something that he responded. But, you know, it bothered me, and it has continued to bother me that this is the way we extend the war legacy through language, through the visuals, through the images in the community that has deeply suffered the war. So this is something I really felt, I'm sharing this for the first time. I felt really obliged and committed to write something about this, to analyze the language, the way these visuals have been, you know, produced and manipulated with, and sort of used to recruit the children, in my opinion. There is another piece of the context also, which is a global context. I'm not sure whether you agree with this or you disagree with this, but to a great extent, this is, again, a stumbling stone for us in the humanities, who are trying to do some good to restore the belief in humanities, that it's not just all about the technocratic education, and it's not all about sciences, hard sciences, but there's so much to humanities. That we need to restore in a way that they really deserve the status of the field that has been greatly marginalized as a result, not just, I think, here, but globally. So I think globally we have been tackling this, we have been going through this battle really to restore the status of humanities in a way that it really deserves. So I think this is also adding in the context. I'm starting with a very large context. This is another piece of heartbreaking information from the context of the US. I can tell you, since I came here, and I'm sharing again this for the first time publicly in this lecture, because it very much relates to the topic and to the field that I have been working on for so many years. So I've started at the age of 18. I've been in this field for 30 years now. So ever since I came to the United States, I have been overwhelmed with the news, through language, through instances of violence, of the mass shooting, that I also discovered this website of Gun Violence Archive that has reported that we are now in the mid-week or the second week, third week of February. Since the beginning of the 2023, in the United States, there have been 71 mass shootings that have taken place across the country in just the first 6 weeks of the 2023. And these scenes of agony, the scenes of horror, I think I read also in one of the newspapers, magazines, it's indicating that the United States is at civil war in a way, if you really see the casualties, the results of the violence that has been produced. If you go to this website, you would see the casualties and the fear that is also emerging as part of my research that I'm doing now, which is related to language education and teaching, but a lot of instances of the issues of the contested issues of gun violence and mass shooting in the United States are also surfacing the discussions that I'm having with teachers as part of my Education for Peace research in the United States. And lastly, this other piece that has also been done as part of the research through the organization Reimagining Migration. It's another sort of element that is also producing this broader context of why I have been working in this field. And this is the one that shows that 27% of the students nationwide, and this applies for the United States of America, they feel invisible in terms of their feelings of belonging. That greatly impacts student success. And also for these relationships to develop, young people have to feel like they belong. And a lot of them, based on this research, a great number of them, 27% of them, do not feel like that. And educators lack a culturally informed measure of school climate that would respond to this level of diversity. So this is a sort of the argument that this research has been establishing. And I have become really interested because they use a lot of pedagogies that revolve around through the narratives of children's literature, for example, that can promote these feelings of belonging through language and language acquisition and these kinds of narratives. So what are the important lessons in the larger framework that I have tried to sort of put together as a framework of what we have? And of course, this is not inclusive. It's much more complex than I could present for the sake of this lecture. The important lessons are that violent conflict can change and disrupt everything that we regard as normal and have extensive effects, visible or invisible, on how people and communities think, feel, remember, and function. And these long-term dislocations, forcible displacement, severe traumas and fragility, and they do not relate only to conflict and post-conflict communities. They also relate to the communities that are vulnerable as a result of violence actions. So these sort of long-term feelings can further complicate the issues that need healing and reconciliation and reconstruction, resolution. Another important element that is an important piece of lesson is that education is never neutral. So this was also something that I discussed with teachers of language as part of my PhD dissertation, where a lot of these educators would neglect their political sort of position, not realizing that any sort of pedagogy that they use in a classroom would have some political implications. So neglecting the role of education in peace building can contribute to cycles of conflict and violence. So it can be that education can act out as an accomplice to conflict or violence, if you want, if we do not address these issues seriously. And there is only a proactive approach to peace building that can increase resilience and provide valuable opportunities to rebuild, heal, and grow. So it has to be systematic. It has to be institutional. And this leads us to the main core of my lecture, because I said joining hands of peace education and peace pedagogy. So now that I have presented something that I consider as a framework of why I have been involved in the field, it brings us to something that is more sort of constructive and more positive and more action oriented. So we do not feel like helpless and we do not sort of act out on this learned helplessness. And there are ways to address these issues. And luckily, through language education and language teaching, we have a lot of power and we are in a position to use our classes and our positions of authority in the classroom and in the schools and in education in general to promote and to infuse and frame our teaching in the context of peace education. This is just a general framework of what peace education stands for. So it's an international ideal, and it started basically after the Second World War with 50 plus, so more than 50 years of theory, debate, research. And let me just, for the sake of time, just go through briefly through some of these major elements that are sort of illustrating the complexity of the field of peace education. So there is a lot of discussion around negative peace, which is the absence of violence, which is not sufficient. It's insufficient if we are not also working on the positive peace, which is a key to sustainable well-being and development. And positive peace a lot of times involve also social justice, economic prosperity for all, access to equal sort of opportunities. Something that is less agreed in this field of peace education, that there is a huge importance also of building your inner peace, also for educators, for teachers of languages. If you want to teach peace, you also have to deal a lot with your inner peace and the frameworks and the ways you understand, so conceptualize peace. So this is less sort of agreed upon. It's also complex and sensitive, especially in the context of massive violence and human rights abuse. And we see that it's also very complex, even here in the context of the United States, with the gun violence and with the instances of mass shooting. It's a very sensitive topic because it involves a lot of sensitivity, a lot of trauma. Different contexts would require different pedagogical aims. And also it must be grounded in critical perspectives on power relations, self-reflection, conscientization and praxis, which is the Freirean concept, integrational societal healing, and many other elements. Here, I have just sort of framed something that is different name for probably something that you have been involved in or have been working on through your own niche in language teaching and learning or in the field of education. So these are just under the umbrella of peace education. There are different models of education that also go under the framework of peace education. So we have human rights, disarmament education, nonviolence, conflict resolution, environmental, global citizenship education, and you see many other critical peace, multicultural, intercultural, as opposed to something, not as opposed, but also equally important is the distinction that my colleague, my dear friend and a colleague, Dr. Sarah Clark Habibi and myself have established in the book that is also forthcoming, which is on peace pedagogy in Bosnia and Herzegovina, theory and practice in formal education, where we to a great extent actually discuss peace pedagogy as opposed to peace education. While peace education is concerned with the what of education, so what we teach in terms of topics and content, peace pedagogy is more focused on how we teach and why. So what are the reasons behind, what are the values we want to infuse and how we do that. So we have been very much concerned with the pedagogy of peace. And there are also different, the theoretical frameworks are very rich, have been developed. Some of them are emerging, like we know about participatory, inclusive, reflective, experiential, arts-based, democratic, nonviolence, critical pedagogy. They have been feminist, they have been greatly established, but the pedagogies of remembrance, reconciliation, or decolonial pedagogies have been sort of emerging for some time now. And we are still learning, especially for different contexts, how they best apply in these specific educational contexts. So it all brings us then, on one hand, as I mentioned, I would do in my lecture, I would present sort of a framework of peace education and pedagogy, but then on the other hand, we have the role of language and how language is used for the sake and for the purposes of infusing peace. So I found this example here on the way language is used in this sentence. So, for example, it's easy to envisage a colleague at work saying they might shoot you an email to inform you they're right on target to execute a project by a certain deadline. So how might the effect be different if they instead said, they might send you a message to let you know they're on track to complete a project by a certain date. So I chose this example, and I'm using such example as many other examples to introduce peace learning and peace frameworks when I do language teaching with my students and when I do pedagogies with my students, to sort of raise the awareness that since violence has in many ways been naturalized in mainstream language use, insidious effects may not always be apparent. So this is the same with these images of violence. You might think that your child will just get some entertainment. No, it will prime his way of thinking and believing and the values that he or she will internalize. However, as sociolinguist Karol Janicki points out, repetitive exposure to words, priming, which is called also priming, affects our beliefs, which may induce or prolong peace or conflict. So it's really important how we use language. So this is something that we have to be critically sort of reflecting upon. The peace education also in connection to the way we use peace is that language, the way we language peace, and here language is used as a verb. So the way we language peace influences the way that we do peace. So it's really important, again, how we also speak of these frameworks and of these policies and of these strategies, because the languaging and doing peace are not always coherent, because we can, and I also put here as a clarification, these peace ideals communicated in text can be recontextualized depending on what the context is, what is the situation in your community, what is a broader political context, what is a dominant narrative, right? Economic, cultural space. Because these discursive framings will always affect the choices and practices and would shape our thinking and also our acting. So again, it's really important what we expose, especially for in the context of educational and pedagogical reasons. So this brings us to the peace linguistics. I have to admit that I have discovered, so I have been doing a lot of peace education and peace pedagogy, and I have been doing a lot of nonviolent communication. But since recently, I have actually discovered by doing research that there has been, to my shame, something that I haven't been aware of. There have been a lot of attempts that have tried to introduce and establish the field of peace linguistics within the field of applied and sociolinguistics for some time now. So it started, if you really think of the connection of culture and language, so this is something that I had as the awareness and that I have also deeply explored as part of my intercultural learning thesis, because this was the topic of my doctoral dissertation, and also through Rosenberg's sort of nonviolent communication, emphasizing that with consciousness, we can make choices about what we speak and how we express ourselves, how we show empathy and how we listen to each other. And Rebecca Oxford, also a well-known language educator, she also talked about peace consciousness, that it involved the awareness, the attention, the focus, and the effort that we have to make towards expanding the peace. But then, on the other hand, there have been these attempts, and Joycelyn Wright, she also wrote a lot about, she has attempted to revive some of these legacies that have been sitting there, but that have not made sort of a breakthrough in the sociolinguistics and applied linguistics with a status I think that they should have. And she sort of emphasized this interdisciplinarity of how language is used effectively or not used to meet the transformative goals of reducing or improving our handling of conflicts, our handling of violence, wars, etc. And this is bringing us to something that is a contribution basically of someone that we consider the father of the peace linguistics in the field, with the coining of the word communicative peace, which was coined by the Brazilian scholar Francisco Gomes de Matos in his article of 1991, What the World Needs to Know, Communicative Peace, where he described this as a new thought and action provoking way of humanizing competence. And he also extended that we need to communicate constructively and in ways that foster well-being. So this early pioneer, so de Matos as an early pioneer who was actually, as I said, he was the father of the early stages of really pioneering the work in peace linguistics, has been extended also by his compatriot sociolinguist Patricia Frederick in the first decade, and that also continued with some other people getting involved. If you look at the book by David Crystal on some definitions in linguistics and phonetics, I think, Dictionary of Linguistics from 1999, you can also find the term of peace linguistics. So this was a big learning for me as well. I was really glad to see it. 1999, it was already established there as a sort of a, giving a prominent role and room. And you have here also something that has been defined by David Crystal, also prominent and esteemed British scholar in connection to peace linguistics. So this professor, Brazilian language teacher, trainer, scholar, human rights activist, and poet, has been actually ascribed this sort of recognition and acknowledgement for starting the field and really inspiring the work of many other peace linguists and sociolinguists at a time. In 2000 year, Gomes de Matos also emphasized the need to distinguish between simply communicating about peace and taking the more transformative action stance of communicating peacefully. So not just thinking in terms of analyzing at the level of really understanding the messages, but really sort of making an effort that how we speak would engage and be sort of recognized as very transformative in a way that he believed that we should learn to speak peace, the only global language that will cause violent communication to cease. And there is a little poem here also that he wrote that speaks to this message. More than a universally avoided violence, it's the constructing of peaceful permanence. More than preventing the evils of violence, let's universally sustain non-killing sense. So that under this umbrella of peace linguistics, we also have sociolinguistic work that is currently being undertaken in a new area called non-killing linguistics. I'm not sure if some of you are also familiar. This was also new to me. I have learned a lot just by researching this piece. So it has been established also as a non-killing linguistics pioneered by these authors. And again, you have some of these sort of references to what they stand for. So how is peace linguistics related to what and how we teach? And I'm looking at the time. I think I'll just go quickly to the last part of my presentation. Did you say that I have like 10 minutes in the end for some questions? Is that okay? 10 minutes? So the intersection of applied linguistics and peace and the integration of communicative peace into the notion of communicative competence is something that this particular linguist has dedicated also his whole life to. Luckily, I'm also at the very end of my final part, briefly just going through some of the slides. I can share the full presentation with those of you who would be interested, because there are some practical examples at the very end. I wanted to share something that we have established at the University of Sarajevo as something that is an attempt to institutionalize the education for peace, peace building, and peace pedagogy at the level of the formal education initiative. And we started this Peace Education Hub several years ago as part of larger international network initiative that has involved universities from Rwanda, Colombia, United Kingdom, and Bosnia and Herzegovina to discuss the best practices in pedagogy of how peace could be taught and how peace could be infused and integrated into the existing curricula. We did a lot of student research where we used the images from different cultural contexts, where students were thinking in terms of how language is used in their cultures and in their languages, by using the visuals, by using some of the images that represent their culture to actually initiate the discussions around peace and violence. And we also discussed the role of universities in peace building in that regard. And I'll just speak briefly that when it comes, as you can see on this slide, you have various different roles in different aspects of the higher education institutions where you have the potential to infuse peace into the educational frameworks. But I'll focus from the policies to the research and peace studies, and some of them are existent across the universities. But I'll speak here for the curriculum, because this is where language education comes in place. So through the curriculum, it's really important that we initiate peace and conflict studies and peace education by recognizing that each discipline can contribute to conflict and peace, to the discussions around peace and conflict, to analyze the potential with students as part of the curriculum, and to develop these applications in each field. So this is something that I think is really a potential for language education. Some of the challenges at the institutional level. So the third mission of the university, whether we can actually incorporate and integrate the students' hearts and actions in addition to their minds, is something of a challenge, I think, not just here, but globally. Also, can we prioritize the contribution to the public good rather than training our students to have the tools to go to the market, but to do something for the public good in the community? So can we do that as educational institutions? And also another challenge is that there is no training for teachers whatsoever, in particular in language education, to train and prepare them on how to teach controversial and sensitive issues. Because a lot of these discussions, and this is emerging in my research that I'm doing here with the educators in the United States, they feel inadequately supported institutionally by the community, by the administrators, but also in terms of pedagogies of what to use in their classrooms. So this is an inadequate training and education for teachers. Just a couple of these examples. So by researching, I also could trace back, for example, in 2000, there was another publication by the same author who has pioneered the field. And then we have also some other attempts to revive the idea of peace linguistics. So we have the paper by Curtis, a prominent member of the International Association, Whatever Happened to Peace Linguistics, who tried to revive the sort of spirit of peace linguistics. So if you see the intercultural aspect of learning has been dominating the field in terms of understanding, because there's a lot of potential in intercultural approach to language education and teaching to use these skills to sort of promote tolerance and tolerance of ambiguities in communication, and understanding how to negotiate and how to mediate between different cultures and use the language for that purpose. Little has been published, to my knowledge, and these are really the prominent, the books that have made some breakthrough. And I was happy to find one of those since I came here to Cornell, and this is a compilation, and I strongly recommend. It speaks great volumes to everything that I have been researching and doing for many years. And this is this Peace Building in Language Education, Innovations in Theory and Practice, with a group of authors who edited, and of course the contribution of Rebecca Oxford, who just who published this, but also initiated this other sort of collected, co-edited volume. So she hasn't published just on the strategies in language acquisition and teaching, but also she published extensively on the role of peace. Several other ideas in terms of methodologies and pedagogies. So just briefly, so this is one framework that we have been using in our work on how we infuse peace through language teaching. So we pay a great attention, we dedicate a great amount of time, and we pay great attention to the issues of teaching controversial issues. So this has been proposed and framed by the professor Judy Pace from the University of San Francisco, with whom we have also established some deep connections and have done some work. So she started a course on teaching controversial issues, and we have been taking some modules and we have been taking some elements to infuse them in our teacher education for language teaching. So she speaks of these different roles of teachers, in not just in language education, but across the curriculum, of those who are risk takers, of those who contain risks in classrooms, and those who would avoid controversial issues. And then we bring in these issues on the table for a discussion. We learn how to frame controversial issue and how to debate it. And we always connect it to the context, which is current as a problematic issue in our community. So these are some of the examples of the issues that we did together with them in our online summer school on peace pedagogy through the Peace Education Hub. We use a lot of visuals. So this one is to introduce different aspects of visible and invisible elements of culture. We use a lot of arts-based pedagogies to discuss and initiate the discussions around cultural differences. We also use documentaries, for example, the Eye of the Storm framework methodology. I don't know if you are familiar, but it has been developed as a didactic tool through Facing History organization, but I think through some other programs as well. And I have been working on these issues. This is the context of the 70s in the United States after the assassination of Martin Luther King, when this teacher actually introduced something that was played out as a social experiment of teaching her kids beyond the curriculum of what mattered in terms of recognizing the prejudices and discriminatory practices in the United States. And it just initiates a lot of important discussions in responsibilities, social and moral responsibilities of language educators, of language teachers, and also many other practical tools. Like this Tasks for Democracy has got like 60 activities that you can adapt for language education and language teaching. We also, to a great extent, use Reimagining Migration that I said, Facing History and Ourselves, because it speaks directly to language education through historical and cultural aspects of teaching. And some of the European contexts, I'm not sure whether they have been used here, but we have been using them a lot. So a lot of the proposed frameworks by Council of Europe and European Center for Modern Languages. So I have been integrating a lot of these modules of the European portfolio for student teachers of languages and Pepelino, which is for pre-primary education, where you can see this critical reflection element in language teaching and learning. So you see, for example, different branches in this reflective sort of framework, where you have a lot of potential. For example, if you discuss the context, the role of the language teacher, you can invite teachers to critically reevaluate their responsibilities in tackling these issues. Or if you speak of the assessment of learning or the conducting of lesson or independent learning, actually any branch here could be connected to how we use language. And also here are some of the elements from this reflective tool where you actually see how culture is evaluated or how speaking activities are selected, where students have been actually presented with lots of indicators, like close to 200 indicators, to go through, critically to go through the development of their competencies with the focus. And then I gear the discussion around some of the issues that are important in the context of Bosnia. And just lastly, several of the portfolios that my students also use to integrate these experiences, to sort of share in a group forum sharing of how they have integrated different strategies and tools in their own teaching. And this is it. In the end, the final remarks, the potential of English language teaching and the potential impact and what that means. I'm not going to read these, but there's a lot of here for us to think about, in particular in connection to language education. And I will leave you with a quote, because I started off with some of the very sensitive and difficult contexts, but I think I'll finish with a more hopeful note and energy that I'd like to read by Paulo Freire. Hope, as it happens, is so important for our existence, individual and social, that we must make every care not to experience it in a mistaken form and thereby allow it to slip towards hopelessness and immobility. One of the tasks of the progressive educator, through a serious, correct political analysis, is to unveil opportunities for hope, no matter what the obstacles may be. After all, without hope, there is little we can do. And I'll leave you with that sort of hopeful, hopefully hopeful note for all of us who are striving to introduce something which is framed within, with these sort of philosophies and these ideas in mind. And thank you so much. And I apologize, I'm always bad with time. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. This was very powerful. I think lots of ideas for what we can do to just be more mindful about how we use language and how we can integrate these aspects of peace pedagogy in our own teaching. We'd like to open the floor for questions, either here in the room or on Zoom. If you have questions on Zoom, please put them in chat. Feel free to raise your hand as well. And we do have questions in the audience here. If you can briefly introduce yourself and pose your question.
Hi, my name is Ezra. I'm a freshman here at Cornell in the major of global development. And my question is, you alluded earlier to, like, for yourself, you learned English kind of late. I remember from psychology, there's like a critical period for language acquisition. Do you think there's a critical period for learning peaceful, inclusive language? So would is your target for this language, is it young people? Is it all people? Who's your target for language acquisition?
Thank you for that question. I think it's really something I believe that has to be our humanity sort of decision for the overall humanity, for the survival of our human race. So I would target, like, you know, from the day one you're born. I think we have to be very mindful what we expose our children to, how we use language, or either to have discussions around situations when language is not used purposefully to promote something that is harmony and understanding and peace, but to have critical reflections upon, like I presented the example with my son, why this wouldn't be appropriate. Because I got some suggestions from some of the friends, maybe he should have gone, so he should have learned something on his own to make such decisions. I opted for such an approach, to have a critical sort of reflection upon what it means to be exposed and to be sort of immersed into the playful violence, right? If this is a contradiction in such a phrase. So I would definitely argue from the early ages on. And I like the way you compare that to critical period of language acquisition. So I think that the earlier we start to be more aware of how we use language and how we can hurt someone with the words, and how that can produce situations, if we start from a small sort of family setting, how your words can be hurtful for your sibling in first place. So to start from the family, from that context. And absolutely, I advocate for infusing these frameworks across the curriculum more strategically and more systemically, through educational systems and across different disciplines. So global development would have also great responsibilities in a way how development is understood and how we can use different niche of other disciplines to promote and infuse peace. So thank you for that. I'll remember this sort of parallel to critical period of peace acquisition as opposed to language, second language acquisition. Thank you for that. Any other comments or questions?
Thank you for this really powerful talk. So you spoke about this idea as part of peace education is promoting feelings of belonging in the language acquisition, through language acquisition. So I'm just curious to know, in the Bosnian context, how does English language education, what are some ways that increases students' sense of belonging?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good one. So for me, I can start reflecting by just sharing the experience of how English has sort of served as a buffer to directly address. It was a sort of a protection, because I always feel that I need a little bit of, competence to get to the level that I feel comfortable in English the way I feel comfortable in my mother language. So if you discuss something that is difficult, that is very traumatic, that is contested, I think English language in that sense can also provide certain level of protection when you discuss and bring in some of these difficult issues, because you address them indirectly, because you address them through a different language, through a different culture, and through a different context. And this is what I have felt has been the case for me. So English has always served. Even when I translated it, there has always been some sort of a, buffering protection. On the other hand, English also has enabled the sense of belonging, is that English for me has also enabled this sense of belonging to a global community, to a much broader community of other people who are also, thriving, who are also struggling, who are also facing similar problems, similar sort of, struggles and battles, no matter where they come from. So English in that way was sort of unifying in a way that it had provided this sense of belonging and sharing across cultures and across sort of these borderlines. And this is what I advocate. I found the niche of English language education to introduce something that is very contested for the Bosnian, reality. And I thought it was easier to do that through English language education and through English language teaching than directly through the history or through the Bosnian language, to empower our students and to empower future teachers to think more strategically and to think more sort of constructively, if you want, in a way where they can give the tools and create these possibilities for the learners, where they will be more mindful of how they use language, but also empowered to do some and affect some change in their own communities. So definitely English has provided, also through literature in English, it has been very comforting. I started studying English language and literature officially as part of my BA right after the war. So it has provided a lot of comfort through literature, just to identify with different, with different sort of genre, with different contexts. So it had a power also of healing. So this has been the experience for me. So I even started language education, not to become a teacher, but really to find a sense of like normalcy in something that has been, created right after the war in a very difficult context. But, reading literature, enjoying language, discussing something that normal people would do, has provided this sort of sense of belonging and comfort and healing. So definitely a lot of potential, I would say. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. Is the microphone working? Okay. Thank you. You really made me think about this additional benefit of my profession as a language teacher. I think there are many subjects in school that could be taught in such a way as to encourage a sense of belonging. You can teach chemistry, and presumably almost all the children will be equally good in learning about molecules and compounds. So that is a way to encourage feelings of belonging and equality. History is sort of the reverse, especially when you think about Bosnia, because different ethnic groups have their own view of history, which can be 180 degrees opposed. Even though there are three groups, they can still be 180 degrees opposed.
Absolutely.
But language teaching, second language teaching, it could be English, it could be Spanish,
Sure.
it could be ancient Greek, but I can see now that it has potentially it has benefits for all the children in the classroom. And thank
Okay.
you for pointing them out.
Thank you so much. Thank you also for coming, Wales.
Well, so in the interest of time, we do want to respect everybody's time. For those of you who are here in Stimson Hall, of course, please stay and mingle and keep asking questions of Larisa. But thank you all for coming today, and please join me in really thanking Larisa for this wonderful and important talk tonight. Thank you so much.
Everyone.